To succeed and thrive at C-suite level, you need strategic clarity and operational excellence. Hello and welcome to the C-Suite Framework podcast. My name is Jennifer Geary. I am so excited to launch this podcast. This has been something on my mind ever since I wrote my first book over 7 years ago. When I wrote How to Be a Chief Operating Officer, I leaned on and consulted so many experts in their fields. And since writing that book and writing an additional 4, as well as through the whole 30 years of my career, I have met some incredibly intelligent, perceptive, witty, knowledgeable people and used their advice, their knowledge, their frameworks to help me shape my roles and also my books. Finally, I get to bring some of those people here to this podcast where we will talk about topics that directly reference the book. So we will talk about things like strategy, culture, prioritization, agility, but also some of the tangential areas that maybe some C-suite experts don't know about yet. And my hope is that this ongoing podcast will provide timely, relevant, interesting, fun content to help you on your journey, either in the C-suite already or aspiring to that first C-suite role. For my first podcast, I could not have been happier to meet Dr. Max McKeown. Max is author of a range of books about strategy, including the best-selling strategy book in the world called The Strategy Book, which is now on its 4th edition. If you've ever seen Dr. Max in action, he is a dynamo. He is full of energy. He stands in front of a big whiteboard and he scribbles and doodles and draws and brings strategy to life in a way that nobody else does, frankly. His advice is always actionable. It is always sensible. It's never abstract. It's never complicated. And for a subject like strategy, which can be really intimidating, especially to a new to role C-suite executive when there's so much to do, he will take you through the simple steps to ask yourself and your organization some key questions about strategy to make sure that you're on the right track before you set off. Because if you don't have the strategy right, all your subsequent work is for nothing. You're holed below the waterline. Everything will be harder than you think. I can't wait for you to hear this great talk with Dr. Max McKeown. Check it out now. I am delighted to be joined on the podcast today by Dr. Max McKeown. Max McKeown is a writer, consultant, and researcher specializing in innovation strategy, leadership, and culture. He has written 6 influential books and conducts research with Warwick Business School. He is a fellow of the RSA. He served on the advisory board for the Rollins Centre for E-Business, and he earned his master's and PhD from Warwick Business School. He is a speaker, innovator, and author of The Strategy Book, Adaptability, and the Innovation Book. He is the creator of Speed Strategy. He is a strategic psychologist. And might I say, Max, an all-around rock star. Welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you very much. And it's great to be here, especially with your kind of focus. It's a group I work with a lot, and that transition between the ambitious to the successful is such an interesting area for both adaptability and for strategy and strategic thinking. I mean, I've often talked about the fact that the real difference between the good manager and the great leader is strategic thinking. So great to be talking to an audience and a person who's an expert in that area.
First things first, I've got to clear something up. I'm Irish. You would be Max McKeown in Ireland, but I've heard you introduce yourself as Max McKeown. So let's get that right first of all.
Okay, so the name is Irish and comes from, there's a McEwanstown in Antrim. So my grandfather was Scots-Irish, spending time in both with a Scottish and an Irish parent. So it's both. And we've ended up with McKeown because of the Scots, and anybody in Ireland corrects us. But you live with what you've given.
Okay, McKeown it is then, though. I'll take it from there. And also, I appreciate this is a visual thing, but I'm just holding up my copy of the strategy book, which is not your latest copy. I know that, but I don't know if you can see quite how dog-eared this book is and how many pages have been folded down. It has been a Bible for me as I think about and talk about strategy, and I know we're going to get into some of that today. So it's a terrific book.
I'm just really glad that that's the position it's in. The only bad thing about it at all is that people buy one copy and that is it. They don't want to upgrade because they've invested so much of themselves in it. It's not a book just to be read or to be referred to once or for a course, as you've discovered. It's sort of packed full. I was asked by a group of MBA students years ago before it was written. I'd given some workshop to them and they said, well, which book do you really recommend that can do all of it, that's exciting as well as deep? And I thought, but I don't believe there is one, really. I'd read lots at that point and researched it and had my PhD, but there wasn't one, which is why I wrote the one that you've got there. And it came from there, really, user requests, a problem that existed, and then answering that problem.
Well, listen, let's get into it a little bit. First of all, just tell us quickly about your background. How does one become a strategic psychologist and all-round rock star? What was your past? Tell us a bit about that.
Well, I'm the world's only, like Sherlock Holmes was the world's only consulting detective, I'm the world's only strategic psychologist. So I think I was inspired by that a little. Okay, one version is I was just always, from birth, I think, a little wild and also a little like the Max in the Wild Things book. And I was also really interested in how things fit together, those two. I wanted to get behind the scenes. So if I went to a theatre even as a kid to pantomime, I wanted to go behind the stage and find out what was really happening. If I saw a magic show, I wanted to know how the magic trick was done. So I guess I was both a pain and curious. And that curiosity about how the world was and getting behind the scene to know who Oz was, Wizard of Oz. What's behind the scene? What's the blue pill? What's really going on here? Really was, I think, integral to my nature from probably the very beginning of creation. And that's what I really have followed ever since. How do you shape things? How do you take them apart? How do you alter them so that they're more the way that you want? Because stability is an illusion. We have made the whole world. It can be remade. It's up to us.
I'm reading a book at the moment that is using the word perma-crisis. The crises are coming faster and faster. One is leading into another. There is no sort of stable anymore. And so agility and resilience just becomes, and we're definitely going to get into that a little bit, I think, here. It becomes so important. But let me ask you then, along this journey, so you wanted to break things apart and all that kind of thing. Tell me about an early aha moment when you understood viscerally this thing called strategy and its ability to make the difference between success and failure. Can you illustrate that for us?
Yeah, I suppose when you said the earliest, I did think immediately, it feels a bit like Desert Island Discs. So I'm thinking carefully about my answers. But that idea that I think the earliest was I could see one thing leading to another. And I think this answer will lead on to answering the second question. Because I say strategy is not a document. Strategy is everything that leads from where you are to where you end up. And ideally, it's everything that leads from where you are to where you want to be. Essentially, there's always cause and effect in life. The difference between the strategic thinker is that they wish to do better than luck and understand the rules of that and then follow them through. So as a kid, I ended up in accidents and scrapes. And to me, that was an early cause and effect. I climbed up. I could climb at walk around at 9 months. And by 18 months, I'd pulled a TV down on my finger and chopped it off. Then I had to have it resewn. And so in a way, that's this cause and effect. Stuff happens, good and bad. How can you shape it? And that's what really influenced it all the way through. Seeing how that worked at school, cause and effect, good, bad, indifferent, creative. And that meant that when I got into the world of work, even very early, working in a butcher's and then eventually in global companies, I could see how one thing could lead to another. And they used this word I don't know if anyone listening has watched Princess Bride, the movie, and there's a part in which somebody says that word, I don't think that word means what you think it means, the hero is saying to the villain. And I thought it was similar, that when I got into those rooms, I really wanted to get into them. I thought, I'm doing a job for somebody, they're paying me. I want to know what the person in the big office is doing, because that is what is setting the rules and determining how my life is at work. So I wanted to understand that. And from that, when I eventually got into that room, I discovered that those people don't always know either. And so that was part of it, really. You're paying me this. I worked for First Direct Bank in the UK, their first telephone bank. And I was there writing letters in a very formal way. And yes, I knew that people didn't want a formal answer. So I started changing it, and some guy told me I was doing it wrong. And then I thought, again, how fixed this can get, that the good idea I had was not listened to. So I wanted to be in the big room, but I also wanted to be in the big room to influence things for the little person.
So going right back, that Oz pulling the levers in the background behind the curtain was having all of these, some visible, some invisible effects on everybody downstream throughout the organization. And it sounds like you felt it on both sides. You experienced maybe when it's suboptimal, when a rule has been put in place for some reason and it doesn't make sense, but that's coming from somewhere on high, sometimes intended, sometimes unintended, right? And then that led you, I guess, to want to see what was going on in, what do they say in Hamilton, the room where the decisions are made?
Yes, and then you get there, as some of your listeners either have got there or would like to, and then they get to the big room and they have what some of your listeners you would know as the Peter principle. They get there and they realize that whatever got them there is not going to get them any further. It's not quite what they thought. It's not what they thought somebody else had the answers, and it turns out they really didn't. They're just older versions of themselves. And I really like doing that too, to show people that they don't just have to fake. They really can shape the future in the way that they always imagined, if they understand what the difference between being the manager and the leader is, and not to forget it. So, I mean, we'll get into that, but how do you connect those two so that strategy and culture work together in ways that are helpful, and we don't get stuck in what I've described as a miserable equilibrium where nobody's happy. It continues forever. You have a civil war, nobody's happy. You have unhappy customers, unhappy employees, and unhappy shareholders. How can that possibly be so? There must be a better way. And I think that's what strategy is about, finding a better way.
I think that's so true. And I think when you do get into one of those big senior roles for the first time, and maybe you do expect there's going to be a sort of a ta-da, and somebody pulls off a silver platter and you're like, oh, there's a strategy and it all makes sense and it's genius and it's fabulous. And maybe I'm sure there are some strategic leaders out there where like you meet them and you just go, oh my God, the genius kind of thing. But as you say, a lot of the time you get into that room, you start debating it and you're kind of like, oh, okay. There wasn't really a whole lot more to this than maybe I thought. And I think it can be quite a scary moment as an executive. You kind of think the adults know the answer. And as a new to role C-suite executive, you're sitting around that table and then you're like, oh, it does fall to me. And that can be terrifying. And that's when you do actually need some frameworks, some simple questions, some taking it back to some very basic fundamentals to kind of guide you through that. So in all of my books, so I wrote my first book 7 years ago, How to Be a Chief Operating Officer. And we're not going to talk about breakfast cereal. I'm not going to say it. I do put the culture chapter first, and then I put the strategy chapter. But anyway, that's fine. We can go there. But, chapter 2, basically, before I get into all of the technical details about what a COO does, supply chain, finance, risk, HR, legal, all that kind of thing, I say, you've got to engage with the strategy. You've got to understand it. You've got to diagnose it. You've got to decide if it's any good. You've got, if it's suboptimal, you may need to try and change it. This is what you do all the time, Max. How can an aspiring or new to role C-suite executive diagnose a strategy, engage with it, figure out what it means to them? How do you help them through that?
That was so stimulating, all of that. So I'm buzzing with different ideas. One thought that's worth saying is that I suggest to people that if you want to do well at strategy and if you want to rise up, in the organization to increase your level and influence, you quite often need to sit back to move up. And there are all sorts of analogies that are used out there about leaning in and so on. But I think the reason for that is that you have to sort of, instead of getting even busier and doing even more stuff and demonstrating your particular technical expertise that has got you to where you are, you have to be the one that sits back and says, I'm not the performer here. I'm no longer the one who's just clicking the buttons and reporting to somebody. I'm sitting back, I'm seeing the picture, I'm seeing my peers, I'm seeing what I don't know about this big picture in order that I can kind of rise up and have the time first to see that helicopter view before coming back down and re-engaging with the detail. And so that's sitting back in order to rise up, I think, is particularly pertinent to your group. You don't start as COO and then become a more senior version. You start with some other technical expertise that leads you to that point, and you need to keep seeing how all the connected pieces work. And potentially, especially for a COO, see how the CEO wishes to move forward, and the board and the shareholders and the customers, in order to support that. And that can't be shallow. That has to be deep, and that can't be disconnected. It has to be connected. So those are some of the initial thoughts, and we can get to some of the fundamental questions that the person should always be asking. They should always be in their head at all times, so that you see the connections and the big picture.
Let's get into a couple of those now, because get out of my head, right? Because this is exactly what I talk about in terms of those roles. What I try and recommend to people is, if you can, take a few days out for yourself with research, with books, with pens, notebooks, to just think about this role that you're about to take on. And that's whether you're joining a new organization in role or whether you've been promoted up through the organization. You have to step back and think about the organization, its strategy, and your role in it in a completely different way. And you have to resist, exactly as you said, that urge to be busy, that, first 90 days, first 100 days, I've got all these direct reports, I've got teams around me, and it's less visible. And sometimes you have to actually hold that space a little bit and say, I'm going to take some time to do this because it's arguably the most important thing I'm going to do.
I've got with boards before and senior groups, I've said to them, how much of your day, how much of your pie chart do you spend on this thing that we're now doing at this away day? And fairly rarely do they do more than that couple of days, even a year. Maybe they do 4, maybe every 6 months. It's very rare. And they all report that they don't spend enough time. They feel guilty about it. And so this is interesting. So I used to ask them, so what would happen, do you think, if I kidnapped the senior team? How long would the organization thrive for? Would you be comfortable with it surviving for the day, the weekend, the week, the month? Who would step up? Who wouldn't step up? Who would replace you? And depending on those answers, I'd say, well, then you need to prepare them better, because you need to be preparing this next generation. But also, if they would survive, what would you do with your time? Because you're not meant to be doing their jobs. You're meant to be doing your job. You're the only person who can do it. People are hoping that you're doing your job and not their job. And so it very much is saying, but what percentage of your job do you think should be strategic and not operational, which I would have thought for a COO is particularly mind-bending. The idea that I'm the chief operating officer, and yet my work is not actually to be operational. It's to be strategic. So a mixture of those ideas, I think. How long would you survive out? What percentage of your job is strategic? And how can you put back the S into operations? You're the chief operations strategy officer, really, aren't you? Or the chief how to use operations to achieve strategic objectives officer. You're not just the chief operating person.
It's so true. And it's one of the things I said, there's a temptation. As you say, when somebody comes up, they usually get, if they get promoted into role, it's because they've excelled in a particular field, in operations, in strategy, in finance, in legal, whatever it is. And the temptation is always to default and go and stay in your comfort blanket of the things that you know. An very common mistake is that you micromanage the areas you do understand, and you ignore or leave or neglect the areas that you understand less.
most of us are handed. So we end up with one bicep bigger than the other, or one hand that's more able than the other, and so on. And we default to the thing. Somebody who becomes less flexible tends to move less. And so they become weaker and weaker and weaker. These are all basic, fundamental, I should say, physical laws. If you do less of something, you become weaker. If you do more of something, you become stronger, or you can become imbalanced. And it's fascinating to hear you describe that. How, in your experience, have you righted it? I mean, I have my own experiences, but how do you try to encourage somebody to use that other hand or to use the weak bit in order to become a better athlete?
Well, I think my experience, so when I came to my first COO role, I was a trained chartered accountant. I had delivered technology projects. I had run a risk function, and I had been chief of staff in a legal function. So I had 4 of the disciplines of a COO that I was pretty strong in. And that's pretty good, actually. A lot of people would come with one, that kind of way before you come into it. But I counted 16. Which meant that there were 12 that I needed to get at least a working knowledge of and get, and that's really where the concept of the book came from, because I was like, well, where's the book? How can I broaden myself? How can I generalize? And in the end, I had to do it the long way around. I had to research these areas. I had to sit with experts. I had to devise my own framework. And I think I felt once I had a grasp of the most common industry frameworks, the key success factors, the markers of excellence, if I at least had that across the piece, that meant I had something to work with. And I felt a little more confident then to go. And one of the things I do, and I want to talk about your book, I'm talking about mine, but one of the things I do is I say 10 questions to ask your chief technology officer, 10 questions to ask your lawyer, and that kind of thing, so that you had something. It maybe countered that temptation to, as you say, only swing. It's very uncomfortable, isn't it, to turn around and hit a tennis ball or hit a baseball bat the other way.
We've all seen maybe memes, or maybe you've seen the person who only does arm day and they never do leg day at the gym and so on, because they think that only one part of their body is necessary to good health. So I think it's really useful, that thing you're describing, to try to make it clearer that you've only got this many things covered. It's not a criticism, it's just a gap. And I do think it's particularly important in this double act. So when I say that strategy is everything, but everything is not strategy, I'm still saying that strategy is everything that takes you from where you are to where you want to be, or from where you are to where you don't want to be. It's the journey, but it's not everything. So you've got to find ways of dividing what matters and what doesn't matter, and what should be the priority or not the priority. And I think the COO, even more than as a double act COO, I think of Eisner over at Disney. His COO was the perfect yin-yang combination, so that one could have their foot even more in the what do the shareholders want, what do the customers want, and one could have their head even more in how to do it, what to do, what's our progress. And when that yin and yang work really well together, that is the everything. And so it's important, again, that you understand what that other person wants and what they're getting from reality so that you can respond. I mean, if we're doing athletics, it's the doubles at tennis or volleyball, or the team sport kind of goes neatly with strategy, is not a solo sport, even if you're the CEO or COO. How do you bring the thing together?
And there is no one type of COO. It depends. It absolutely depends on the CEO, because you have to be, as you say, that foil to the other person and that perfect mirror image and match to the other person. But then it's also a function of the stage of the life cycle the organization is in, the types of products and services it's selling, the culture, the people, all of that. And so all of that, each COO role at a point in time is a unique formula and construct that you have to then kind of work out for yourself. This podcast is brought to you by the best-selling How to Be A range of books. These books, authored by me, Jennifer Geary, in collaboration with other seasoned experts, break down roles such as the COO, Chief Risk Officer, Chief People Officer, and Chief Sustainability Officer into their component parts. They explain the technical capabilities you need, but also how to operate at this level, preparing yourself, getting to know your peers, engaging with culture, strategy, building your team, and much more. Over 30,000 books have been sold, and the books have received overwhelmingly positive reviews. There's even a book about the role of AI called The Augmented COO. Check out the books, available on Amazon and Waterstones now. On the strategy, I think one of the things I love about your books, Max, and your approach is strategy can feel very nebulous. It can feel very far away, but your questions are so easy and so practical. And you have a speed strategy approach now that I think can be done in 15 minutes or so, but a very simple boiled down set of questions. Just talk to people, just give people a flavor of what those questions are, just so they understand it's not this scary, weird, nebulous thing that only MBAs can deal with.
Well, when I wrote the very first edition of the strategy book, I thought about what were the key fundamental questions that a strategist asks, or anybody who is strategic, which, of course, for me, means everything living. Everything living has to be strategic or it ceases to exist. You have to find out you have to adapt to the conditions for continued existence and even for thriving. So that's my kind of version of strategy. So I thought, well, what are the key questions? Well, they became, where are we? Where are we going? What do we need to do? How do we need to do it? And how do we measure progress? What's driving us and what's stopping us? And I got a message from somebody who'd picked up a copy of the strategy book, I think the third edition, at an airport. And he said, listen, Max, I don't know you, but I've got your book. I have 7.5 hours to save my career before I get to New York. Can you come up with a strategy in 7.5 hours? Can you help me to do it? A shit hot strategy is what he said, so that I can save my job, etc. And I thought, well, can you do it that quickly? Can you do it so it's joined up? And I thought, yes, you could. And I started sketching. And I thought, not only could you, but if you couldn't do it quickly, maybe your strategy wasn't a strategy worth following at all. That it had to be both simple, strategy is simple, but also complex, present a complex, deep understanding of something. So this is the speed strategy board that I created. So here are those key questions. We put it on huge versions when I'm teaching. We put posters on the wall. We use it in PowerPoint format. It's really the top-bottom approach, way better than SWOT or OKR or business canvases or whatever, because it's dynamic, simple, and can be accessed at all levels really easily. You wouldn't need me here if I gave you it. You'd be able to follow it just fine. But suddenly through these boxes, somebody's able to communicate their ideas strategically. So if you've got, as a COO, you've already decided what the key goals and missions and values of your company are, these become red boxed. You draw a box around those and say, well, those are more or less fixed for now. Where are we at the moment? Well, that's kind of fixed because those are facts. What do we need in order to change those in desirable ways? How do we need to do that? That's culture, that's style, that's approach. How do we measure progress in the 3 to sort of 7 key metrics? I mean, OKRs go just crazy and KPIs are never the key. They're everything, thousands of those things. And then what's driving us so that we remember that, what's blocking us. And with the blockers, you really take what's blocking you and you prioritize that as a way of solving what you do next. I mean, as in, what's the most important thing? The most important thing is the next thing that's stopping you getting to where you're going. These priorities change. And people seem to think that they can prioritize once forever, that there's only one priority. Somebody said that there's only one priority, not plural. I mean, nonsense. There's as many priorities as necessary to get you to where you want to go. So I probably took almost the amount of time it takes to fill it out the first time, just 3 to 5 things in each box. Do it as an individual, then do it as a group, then use it as an agenda. You can use it for brainstorming, for scenario planning. But suddenly you're talking to somebody as a COO and you say to your CEO, but can we just agree our common understanding of this? Yes. Then you can talk to your heads of, you can say, can we talk about this? Because I need you to drive here and I need you to know what's changed and what hasn't changed, so that the whole conversation never moves away from the strategic things that really matter and can really be changed.
It's so practical, but it's so impactful as well. And that piece that you just began to touch on there at the end is sort of, once you've got that squared away with the chief executive and with the leadership team, then there has to be a series of, so what does that mean for me? What's going to stay the same? What's going to change? If nothing changes, I'm not sure you've kind of grappled with it. And, I'm not sure that you've really engaged with the subject matter. So that whole piece of strategy into execution as well. Some people can design a fabulous strategy, but it doesn't actually, the cogs don't engage, right? And it doesn't sort of cascade down the organization as well. And I think the essence of a good strategy should also be something that means, oh, right, well, now we're doing this and not that. We're choosing between things. This is different from yesterday. Do you see that as well? Is that an aspect of a good strategy?
Yes, I thought a few things as you were talking. One was, people can choose or not choose to do something, but for no particularly good reason. And that's not strategic either. They say, well, we can't do everything, so we must choose. And then they have some system, arbitrary or rational, for choosing between them. No, what matters for a strategic thinker, and at the heart of strategy is the mind of the strategist, is how that helps me to get to where I want to be. That's what matters about it. So you can't just once forever decide that this matters or that doesn't matter, or let's stop doing that and let's start doing this. No, you want to keep in every conversation like this. It's why in the Speed Strategy edition, the 4th edition of the strategy book, there's a whole new part that goes through how can you implement strategic thinking in everything that you do, every meeting, a one-to-one almost that we're having here, or a team meeting, or a regular meeting, or a big brainstorm, or a presentation to shareholders. How can you use the same thing that shows how one thing leads to another? The reason we are investing in batteries in this place is because we need to speed this up because of competition in this way, and we need to do it by this date and with this level of flexibility. If we don't, we will have this problem. But these blockers here, lack of expertise, will mean that if we invest without the expertise, not only will we not meet the date, we'll also do a crap job. Can you imagine if someone like General Motors had used that kind of approach to their transformation, how much more effective it would have been? Because they would have known why they were doing things rather than leave it to vague lists. Life is not linear, so strategy shouldn't be either. And if your tools are linear, then you're approaching the thing with the wrong type of tool.
And I think the example that you just gave there of electric cars and all that sort of thing, if your strategy is wrong, I feel like you don't feel it today, you don't necessarily feel it tomorrow, but there's this kind of slow hold below the waterline type feeling, this slow sinking feeling where everything is just getting a little bit harder month on month, quarter on quarter. Your ideas aren't taking off. Your people are struggling. It's like this insidious illness almost that you can't see. But if your strategy is wrong, all the busyness in the world is not going to lead to the results that you need.
It is. It's the long emergency. It's coming, it's coming, it's coming, it's coming. But people will say to me, the energy sector, somebody said to me, if only we'd seen this coming. And I thought, but it was entirely possible to see it coming because people were telling you this thing was coming. What you mean really is, what a shame it was that our approach to strategic thinking wasn't looking at the key trends and then adapting to them. We allowed the day-to-day, keeping the lights on or whatever, to be more important than the shift and the transformation that was required. And that is, I think, the magic and the power of strategic imagination, which is really what we mean by strategic thinking, that it gives you the power to do things while there's still enough time to change. That's what I love about it. I don't just have to wait until my last days to regret something. I can imagine what my last days would be like and do something about it now and not be surprised at the end. I mean, there are always WTF moments, but even those are kind of predictable in that they will happen. That's why we prepare for the future.
There's some life advice in there as well, definitely beyond the world of business. But for a little bit of fun, so we've talked a bit about what makes a good strategy, clarity, purpose, direction, cascading, all that kind of thing. And we won't say any names to protect the guilty and all that kind of thing. But I'd love to hear some examples of bad strategy and some absolute howlers that you might have seen along the way. So my favorite is we will be the most admired. I've seen that in a few places through my career and that kind of thing. The aspiration, the mission statement is we want to be the most admired, blah, de, blah, de, blah in the industry, which I always thought, well, that's easy. Just get a really good PR and don't do any work at all. And you've achieved your strategy. You know, that just struck me as like the weirdest form of non-strategy. But do you have any examples?
I suppose there's a whole range, really. I think of mistakes. That's why, in a way, my books and my sessions are just full of questions and trying to find the right one. Because in some ways, the big mistake is the one that you're making now, or the key next action is the one that will stop you. But some general ones, if nobody can remember what your strategy is, that seems a bad thing. If you can't remember your values, then what's the point of them? If when you get together with a group, you leave the strategic discussion till last. If you're constantly saying that it would be good to look at the future if only we had time, then you're clearly making a mistake. For instance, there are clients who've worked with me before, become CEOs of big companies, sent me messages prior to that saying, we really need to do this. We really need to work together. Sorry, that's me pretending to be them tapping, but really need to work together as soon as I X. And then it's 18 months later and they have not looked at the future and they've run into a wall. And so this constant strategic procrastination is probably the biggest fault for companies, the refusal to look far enough ahead. But then, of course, also the refusal to put it down on paper so that you can see where this is going wrong. I mentioned GM earlier, but they keep coming to mind because the CEO has had 10 years and their biggest achievement is probably that they're still CEO rather than having actually achieved very much for their company. You can look forward. You can see round corners. It is possible.
It's hard. We said at the beginning, it's hard in a new role to maybe carve out time to do this when people expect so much from you, but it is doubly hard 1 or 2 or 5 or 10 years later to say, you know what, we're going to take a look at the strategy. Like, there is no better time than at the beginning.
But who knows what you're doing? That's what I want to know. So the people that I end up working with, they start to learn this, that what they do, there's kind of 3 levels of being strategic when you're busy. There's putting strategy into everything you do so that you are thinking strategically. That's why I think this is a low cognitive load approach. So you're already a busy CEO, and that's the job that you've done, as well as writing all these great books. You've done the job. So I can't bring you something that weighs you down even more. So instead, I say, no, stick this thing up on the board and then quickly do it in 15 minutes and you'll feel a whole lot better because you've got it out of your head onto a piece of paper. And then you can discuss that with yourself. So that's the first. Make it simple. Go with your gut. Keep it simple and let it take off the load. And then the second thing is by implementing it as part of everything that you do, every additional meeting, you will find those are automatically more strategic. You do more with the strategic where and less with the crap where. And you'll probably find that do strategic first so that each thing on the agenda is done in a strategic way rather than waiting to do strategy for a special time. And then, of course, the third thing is actually book out. Nobody knows what you're doing. I think it's nonsense. You're now the COO, or you want to be. Just give yourself the time. What's anybody going to do? Check up on you. It's ridiculous. I mean, the richest man in the world, who is not a person, is a great danger and he's awful. But I think he has successfully demonstrated that it's not whether you look cool or professional. It's not whether you're smoking weed on a podcast and you're working crazy hours. None of that is really necessarily going to affect things. What's going to affect things is whether you are making the right strategic decisions and you have credibility of the people around you. That's what makes the difference.
The power of those ideas and those ideas being the right ones, the critical path to success that you're plotting for your organization looking forward. Max, what one thing do you say to your clients more than anything else?
I think currently is either strategy is everything, but everything is not strategy. to get them to really think through that as a shorthand. Or, of course, which we semi-mentioned earlier, that strategy and culture should eat breakfast together. And I think that's a nice potted thing. I started to say it. And if you can imagine that three things exist as a COO or CEO or just as an individual: strategy, what you're attempting; culture, the way you're attempting it; and then reality, the environment in which you're attempting it. And those things can be completely isolated and eating alone, so that what you do is a complete guess and how you do it is not connected to what you want to do, and neither of those are connected with reality. Or you can go all the way up to a situation where each of them inform the other, so that strategy is really talking to reality all the time and also to the people who are implementing. And so you have the idea of, say, 3 circles separate or 3 circles overlapping. And those are the level 1, eating alone, or level 5, where they're kind of eating together or cooking together what they're doing. I'd say those 2 things the most, because they become shorthand for a particular approach to strategy. I think the only one that in the end works.
And my version of that is I took chapter 2 of every book is culture, chapter 3 is strategy, chapter 4, I use the word execution, which I take to mean all of that theory meeting reality and being translated into the reality of every day.
Yes, it's doing it in reality, as you say, but also, of course, in reality. So you are doing things that really physically, but you can't avoid. We don't do these things in a vacuum. And I think that's when people get a little surprised. They say, well, I've done it. Why hasn't it worked? Well, it hasn't worked because there's something you've misunderstood about the nature of your environment. If you understood it better, you would be able to change what you did and get the result you want. Which is why I think I sometimes say to people, look, it's the art loop. The art of strategy is actions. You do something, results, you get a result, and then thinking, you think about the connection between actions and results, and then you change what you do to change the results. That's the loop. Strategy is an art, of course. It's the art of science. It's the art of seeing the connection and then adapting.
Max, this is amazing, and we could talk all day. You've actually segued me beautifully into my almost last question. So, innovation. You have described innovation as new ideas made useful. And you say that all success is successful adaptation, which is your point about evolution and survival and all that kind of thing. If I'm new to role as a COO, but also as a C-suite member leading my department, what things can I do to harness innovation and build a culture of adaptability?
Okay, so I suppose the first one, new ideas, innovation is new ideas that are made useful. Once you've even grasped that that's the point, that having a new idea is not enough, it's a means to an end, you're thinking strategically about your innovation. And I think then it goes on to you thinking, so if I want to get to this particular desirable end and it's impossible to do so in either the time I want or the costs I want or the way that I want, then I'm going to need innovation. I think it's a very operational way of looking at innovation in that it serves a purpose. And then what you do is you try to organize a culture and a process around that. You say, we want to get from this point to this point. If we can't do it in the way that we want to, we need to look for some new ideas, some new tools to allow us to do that, to allow us to adapt. It's not just about having a creative session. It's about I talk about innovation as practical creativity. It's about having creativity for that purpose. And that makes all the difference, because it means that the creative person their creativity is channeled to what you need. And the less creative traditional person appreciates creativity because it provides them with tools they need. It's that melding of those 2 things, again, that allows us to adapt.
Dr. Max McKeown, your latest strategy book is available in all good bookstores?
In all good bookstores worldwide, yeah. The 4th edition, the Speed Strategy edition. And you can download the things. I do this more as, I think, a contribution to the world, because I think the world could do with better strategy. we're getting ourselves into a mess in various places, and people aren't really surfacing for air, and they just blunder into the next thing, and you can get to some pretty terrible places. Tragedy really is the opposite of strategy, using what we've got to get to somewhere bad rather than using what we've got to get to somewhere better. So I hope people will use it. It's a gift to the world. Please use.
Ain't that the truth in the world today? I wish everybody could take an ounce of the common sense in your approach and in your books. Dr. Max McKeown, thank you very much for being with me today.
Thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure.
We hope you enjoyed the podcast. For more information about the How to Be a books, the C-Suite Framework courses, the podcast, or to get in touch with me, head over to www.csuiteframework.com.